The pilots were shouting about ghosts in the sky. 3 aircraft had disappeared during routine patrol, vanished without a trace against the blinding Pacific horizon. The admiral demanded answers. The mechanics scrambled to check every bolt and rivet, but nobody suspected the truth lay in a paint bucket mixed wrong 6 weeks earlier by a man who couldn't read the labels properly. Leo Hartman's mistake was about to win a war, but first, it nearly got him court-martialed. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The USS Constellation sat heavy in the water, off the coast of San Diego, her deck slick with morning fog and diesel fumes. It was March 1943, and Leo Hartman was already behind schedule. He'd been awake since 0400, tasked with repainting the weather-damaged Hellcats that had come back from the Solomon Islands, looking like they'd been through a sandstorm. The Navy didn't tolerate rust, didn't tolerate delays, and certainly didn't tolerate a 32-year-old ground mechanic who'd only been assigned to carriers because his asthma kept him out of combat. Leo wiped sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained hand, leaving a dark smear across his temple. The paint locker was a cramped steel cave that reeked of turpentine and hot metal, lined with drums and cans labeled in military shorthand he still hadn't fully mastered. He'd come up through civilian garages in Detroit, fixing Fords and Chevrolets for people who paid in cash and complained about every penny. The Navy might as well have been speaking Mandarin with all its codes and requisition forms, but Leo knew engines, knew metal, knew how things fit together, and that had been enough to get him assigned to the Constellation's maintenance crew when they were desperate for hands. The requisition form said he needed 20 gallons of standard Navy blue-gray for the fighters on the forward deck. Leo found the drums marked NBG/41 and started hauling them toward his mixing station, a battered workbench with a hand-crank agitator that had probably been old when his father was born. He'd learned to mix paint from his Uncle Sal, who'd painted houses in Dearborn for 30 years and swore that the secret was in the stirring, not the ingredients. The Navy paint came pre-mixed, technically, but it separated in the drums during transport. And if you didn't blend it right, it went on streaky and peeled within weeks under the salt spray. What Leo didn't notice, what nobody would notice until it was far too late, was that one of the drums he'd grabbed wasn't paint at all. Somewhere in the chaos of the supply chain, a drum of hydraulic fluid had been mislabeled and stored with the paint supplies. The fluid was clear with a slight amber tint, viscous and slick, designed to withstand pressure and heat in the aircraft's mechanical systems. When Leo poured it into his mixing barrel, along with the blue-gray paint, he frowned at the consistency but chalked it up to the humidity. The mixture looked thinner than usual, almost translucent in the weak overhead lighting, but it stirred smooth and didn't separate when he let it sit for a few minutes. He loaded up his spray rig and headed topside, where 6 Grumman F6F Hellcats sat in a neat row, their original paint jobs faded and chipped from combat and weather. The morning shift was just starting, and the deck was alive with organized chaos, crews rolling out planes, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition belts that glinted like brass snakes in the rising sun. Leo set up his equipment near the first aircraft and began spraying, working from tail to nose the way he'd been taught, keeping the nozzle at a consistent distance, overlapping each pass to avoid thin spots. The paint went on differently than he expected. It was smoother, almost too smooth, flowing across the metal skin of the aircraft, like water finding its level. The color looked washed out in the dim dawn light, less vibrant than the standard blue-gray, with an odd matte quality that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. Leo paused, holding his hand up to check the finish. It felt dry to the touch almost immediately, which was unusual. Navy paint typically needed a good 20 minutes before it lost its tackiness. "Hartman, you planning to finish this century?" Chief Petty Officer Vic Rourke's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty saw. Rourke was a career Navy man, 22 years in, with a face like weathered teak and eyes that missed nothing. He walked with a limp from a deck accident in the Atlantic, but nobody ever mentioned it because Rourke could dress you down so thoroughly you'd feel like you'd been scraped with a wire brush. "Just checking the consistency, Chief," Leo replied, not looking up from his work. "Seems to be going on thinner than usual." Rourke stepped closer, squinting at the freshly painted fuselage. He ran a finger along a section Leo had sprayed 10 minutes earlier, then examined his fingertip. "Dry already. That's good. Means we can turn these birds around faster. Looks a little pale, though. You sure you mixed it right?" Followed the specifications exactly, Leo said, which was technically true, even if the specifications hadn't accounted for hydraulic fluid. Might just be the morning light making it look different. Better be, Rourke grunted. We've got a training run scheduled for 0900, and these planes need to be ready. Admiral's got some visiting brass coming next week. Wants everything looking sharp. Can't have our birds looking like they've been painted with dishwater. Leo nodded and went back to work, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. He'd been in enough trouble already 3 months ago for using the wrong gauge wire in a landing gear repair, then again for requisitioning parts without proper authorization. The Navy ran on rules and paperwork, and Leo's casual approach to both had earned him a reputation as competent but careless. One more mistake might see him reassigned to something worse, if such a thing existed. Maybe scrubbing bilges or peeling potatoes in the galley for the duration. He finished the first plane and moved to the second, then the third, working steadily as the sun climbed higher and burned off the morning fog. By 0830, all 6 Hellcats wore their new coat of paint, sitting in formation like toys that had been left out in the sun too long and faded to ghosts of their former selves. The color still bothered Leo. In bright daylight, it looked almost silver blue, with none of the solid, authoritative presence of standard Navy paint. It was too light, too insubstantial, like someone had taken the real color and cut it with chalk dust. But the paint was dry and the planes were ready, and that's what mattered. The training pilots started arriving at 0845, young men barely out of flight school, eager and terrified in equal measure. Leo watched them do their pre-flight checks, walking around the aircraft with clipboards, checking control surfaces and tire pressure and fuel levels. None of them seemed to notice anything unusual about the paint job. To them, a plane was a plane, a machine that would either keep them alive or kill them, and the color of its skin was the least of their concerns. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was the flight leader, a lanky kid from Nebraska with pale blue eyes and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was nervous. He'd been assigned to the Constellation for 5 weeks and had logged maybe 30 hours of carrier time, which in the Pacific Theater made him practically a veteran. He climbed into the cockpit of the lead Hellcat, the one Leo had painted first, and gave a thumbs up to his ground crew. The engine coughed to life with a roar that Leo felt in his chest, and within minutes, all 6 planes were taxiing toward the catapult, their propellers beating the air into submission. Leo watched them launch, one after another, slingshotting off the deck with a violence that never stopped being impressive. They climbed into the morning sky, forming up in a loose V formation, then banked west toward the open ocean, where they'd spend the next 2 hours practicing intercepts and gunnery runs on towed targets. It was routine, the kind of training that happened every day on every carrier in the fleet, preparing boys to become killers before the enemy made corpses of them first. What wasn't routine was the radio call that came in 40 minutes later. Leo was in the machine shop, fabricating a replacement bracket for a damaged bomb rack, when he heard the commotion from the bridge. Voices raised, not quite shouting but urgent. The kind of controlled panic that meant something had gone wrong. He set down his tools and headed topside, where a crowd had gathered near the communications station. They lost visual on 3 of them, someone was saying. Just vanished against the sky. Webb's freaking out, thinks they might have crashed. Radio contact? That was Rourke's voice, sharp with authority. Solid on all 6. They're all reporting normal operation, but Webb and his wingmen can't see Callahan, Rodriguez, or Finch. They're out there somewhere, but completely invisible. Leo felt the knot in his stomach pull tighter. He pushed through the crowd until he could see the radio operator, a skinny kid named Perry, who looked like he was about to wet himself. The radio crackled with static and voices, pilots calling to each other, trying to re-establish visual contact. Through the confusion, one thing became clear. The 3 missing planes were all ones that Leo had painted, and they hadn't crashed. They'd simply disappeared. "This is Callahan. I can see Webb and the others just fine. What do you mean you can't see me? I'm right here. Same formation we've been holding for 20 minutes. "Negative, Callahan. You're not visible. Sky's clear, visibility unlimited, but you're just gone. It's like you're made of air." The radio chatter continued, a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. The planes that could see each other were the ones that had been painted weeks earlier, still wearing the old standard blue-gray. The 3 that had vanished were the ones wearing Leo's accidental mixture, and somehow, against the pale Pacific sky and the glare of the morning sun reflecting off the water, They had become effectively invisible. Admiral Porter arrived on deck 10 minutes later, a compact man with iron-gray hair and a reputation for creative solutions to impossible problems. He'd commanded destroyers in the Atlantic before being transferred to carrier operations, and he had the kind of tactical mind that saw opportunities where others saw only problems. He listened to the radio chatter for 30 seconds, then turned to Rourke. "Which planes are invisible?" "The ones Hartman painted this morning, sir. 3 of them." Porter's eyes found Leo in the crowd, and Leo felt like he'd been pinned by searchlights. "You're Hartman, the mechanic?" "Yes, sir." Leo's voice came out steadier than he felt. "What did you do differently with those 3 planes?" "Nothing, sir. Same paint, same process as always." "Something's different," Porter said flatly. "Planes don't just vanish. Either you use different paint or you applied it differently. Which is it?" Leo's mind raced back through the morning, the dim paint locker, the drums he'd grabbed, the mixture that had seemed too thin. The paint might have been, it looked a little different when I mixed it. Thinner, maybe, but I used what was in the locker, same as always. Porter turned to Rourke. "Get down to that locker and figure out what he mixed. I want to know every ingredient in that batch, and bring me a sample." He looked back at Leo. "You might have just stumbled onto something useful, Hartman, or you might have just ruined 3 perfectly good aircraft. We'll find out which soon enough." The training flight returned 30 minutes later, all 6 planes landing safely despite the invisibility problem. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits talking over each other, excited and confused. Rodriguez, one of the invisible pilots, was adamant that he'd never lost sight of the other planes, couldn't understand how they'd lost sight of him. Leo watched from a distance as the aircraft were towed to a remote corner of the deck, cordoned off with rope and guarded by Marines as if they'd become classified material overnight, which, in a sense, they had. By noon, Rourke had identified the contaminated drum of hydraulic fluid in the paint locker. By 1400 hours, Porter had ordered Leo to mix another batch, this time carefully measuring the ratio of paint to fluid, documenting every step. By 1600 hours, they had a test panel painted with the mixture, hung from the deck railing, and photographed from various angles and distances. The results were undeniable. Against the pale sky and the glare of sun on water, the new paint mixture became almost impossible to see. It wasn't true invisibility, of course. Up close, in good light, the planes were clearly visible. But at any distance beyond a few hundred yards, with the sun in the right position, they seemed to blur into the background, losing their edges, becoming suggestions rather than solid objects. The hydraulic fluid had changed the paint's reflective properties, creating a matte finish that scattered light in unexpected ways, and the diluted pigment produced a color that somehow matched the ambient light of the Pacific Theater better than any carefully designed camouflage. Leo spent the next week under what amounted to house arrest, confined to the ship and forbidden from discussing the paint mixture with anyone. Navy intelligence officers interviewed him 3 times, going over every detail of that morning, trying to determine if he'd done it on purpose, if he might be a saboteur or a spy. They seemed disappointed when all the evidence pointed to simple incompetence, a mechanic who'd grabbed the wrong drum in poor lighting and mixed it without checking. But Porter saw past the mistake to the opportunity. He'd fought in enough battles to know that the side that saw first usually won, and if American planes could attack while effectively invisible, even for a few crucial seconds, it could change the calculus of naval aviation entirely. He ordered Leo to produce 20 more gallons of the mixture, this time with precise measurements and proper documentation. He also ordered complete secrecy, restricted the information to a handful of senior officers, and sent a coded message to Pearl Harbor requesting immediate consultation with Navy Research and Development. The response came back within 48 hours. A team of engineers and chemists would arrive within the week to analyze the mixture and determine if it could be mass-produced. In the meantime, Porter was authorized to conduct field testing with squadron-level security protocols, which meant, in practice, that the Constellation's air wing became the first combat unit to fly with what would eventually be designated Sea Gray number 42, though at the time, it was just Leo Hartman's accidental miracle. The testing began in earnest in April 1943. Entire squadrons were repainted. Missions were flown at different times of day and different weather conditions. Observations were recorded and analyzed. The results varied, but one pattern emerged clearly. During morning and evening hours, when the sun created the most glare on the water, when the sky took on that pale, washed-out quality peculiar to the Pacific, planes painted with Leo's mixture became extraordinarily difficult to track visually. Radar would spot them fine, of course, but radar wasn't everywhere, and in a dogfight, in the chaos of combat, the few seconds it took an enemy pilot to acquire visual contact could mean the difference between shooting and being shot. Leo found himself elevated from anonymous ground mechanic to essential personnel almost overnight. He was assigned an assistant, then a full crew, then a dedicated workspace where he did nothing but mix paint according to the formula that had emerged from his mistake. The Navy chemists refined it somewhat, adjusted the ratios, added stabilizers to prevent separation. But the core mixture remained essentially what Leo had created by accident. 1 part hydraulic fluid to 3 parts standard Navy blue-gray, mixed thoroughly and applied in multiple thin coats rather than one thick one. By June, word of the new paint had spread through unofficial channels to other carriers in the Pacific Fleet. By August, Admiral Nimitz himself had authorized a limited production run, 5,000 gallons to be distributed among the carrier groups seeing the heaviest action. By October, pilots were reporting that enemy fighters seemed to be reacting slower to American attacks, that the crucial element of surprise was lasting a few seconds longer than it used to, and in aerial combat, a few seconds was an eternity. Lieutenant Webb, who'd been so confused during that first training flight, became one of the paint's biggest advocates. He'd survived 2 major engagements off the coast of New Guinea, both times getting into firing position before enemy pilots spotted him, and he credited the paint job with saving his life. He wrote letters to his family about the miracle paint, which Navy censors dutifully redacted, and he pestered Rourke and Porter to ensure that every plane in his squadron got the new coating before their next deployment. Leo watched it all with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He'd come to the Navy expecting to spend the war turning wrenches and staying out of trouble. And instead, he'd accidentally created something that might actually matter, that might save lives and win battles. It didn't erase his other mistakes, didn't make him any better at paperwork or protocol, but it gave him a place in the machine, a purpose beyond just keeping engines running. The Japanese noticed, of course. By late 1943, intelligence reports indicated that enemy pilots were complaining about American planes being harder to see, appearing suddenly out of empty sky. Japanese command attributed it to new tactics or improved pilot training, not realizing that the answer was something as simple as paint. The Germans, too, began to suspect something was different about American naval aviation, though they had bigger problems in the Atlantic to worry about. The first official recognition of the paint's importance came in January 1944, when the Navy Department issued a classified technical bulletin designating the mixture as Sea Gray No. 42, and authorizing its use across all carrier-based aircraft in the Pacific Theater. The bulletin included detailed mixing instructions, application procedures, and maintenance protocols. Buried in the technical language was a single line of acknowledgement, formula initially developed by aviation machinist, Mate 2nd Class Leo Hartman, USS Constellation. Leo was promoted to first class shortly after, more recognition than he'd expected for what had been an honest mistake. Rourke actually smiled when he delivered the news, a rare crack in the chief's granite exterior. "You stumbled into this blind and drunk, Hartman. But I'll be damned if it didn't work out. Just try not to mix any more random chemicals together, yeah? Lightning doesn't strike twice." But the real validation came from the pilots, the men who flew the planes Leo had painted. They'd leave notes in the cockpits sometimes, informal thank yous scrawled on scrap paper or scratched into metal panels. "Thanks for the ghost paint, Hartman. Tell Hartman he's buying when we hit port. Hartman's mixture saved my ass again." Leo collected them, kept them in a battered cigar box under his bunk, tangible proof that his accident had meaning. By spring 1944, virtually every carrier in the Pacific Fleet had adopted Sea Gray No. 42 as standard camouflage. Production had ramped up to meet demand, with proper manufacturing facilities replacing Leo's improvised mixing station. The Navy chemists had refined the formula further, improving its durability and consistency, but they kept Leo involved in the process, consulting him on the application techniques and troubleshooting problems with batch variations. Admiral Porter, who'd been promoted and transferred to Pearl Harbor to oversee fleet operations, made a point of mentioning the paint in his reports to Washington. Not in dramatic terms, the Navy didn't encourage drama, but in the dry language of tactical advantage and operational efficiency. Reduced visual detection range, improved first strike capability, enhanced survivability in daylight operations. The kind of language that made admirals and generals nod approvingly and authorize budget increases. Leo himself never saw combat, never dropped a bomb or fired a gun in anger. His war was fought in paint lockers and machine shops, mixing chemicals and maintaining aircraft, making sure the planes that did fight had every possible advantage. It wasn't glorious, wasn't the kind of story that would be told around fires or carved into monuments, but it was real and it mattered. The war in the Pacific ground on through 1944 and into 45, a brutal campaign of island hopping and carrier battles that consumed lives and ships with ruthless efficiency. Sea Gray, Number 42, became just one more tool in the arsenal, effective but not magical, helpful but not decisive. Wars aren't won by paint jobs. They're won by men willing to fly into fire, by logistics chains that keep fuel flowing and bullets loaded, by intelligence officers and codebreakers and submarine captains and 1,000 other unglamorous necessities that never make the headlines. But every little advantage helped, every edge mattered, and if Leo's accidental mixture gave pilots a few extra seconds of life, if it allowed attacks to succeed that might have failed, if it brought even a handful of men home who otherwise wouldn't have made it, then it was worth the recognition and the promotion and the cigar box full of grateful notes. By the time the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, Sea Gray Number 42 had been in use for over a year and a half. Thousands of aircraft had been painted with it, from Hellcats and Corsairs to the newer jets that were just starting to appear. The Navy calculated that it had contributed to improved combat effectiveness by approximately 15% in daylight operations, a modest but measurable advantage in a war where margins were often razor thin. After the war, Leo stayed in the Navy for another 2 years, training peacetime mechanics in the proper mixing and application of various paints and coatings. He was offered a position with a civilian contractor developing new materials for military aircraft, but he turned it down. The war had changed him, given him confidence he'd never had in civilian life, but it had also shown him that he wasn't cut out for research and development, for laboratories and theoretical work. He was a hands-on mechanic, happiest with a wrench in his hand and grease under his fingernails. He left the service in 1947 and returned to Detroit, where he opened a small garage specializing in aircraft maintenance for the growing civilian aviation market. He never talked much about Sea Gray Number 42, never claimed credit or sought recognition beyond what the Navy had already given him. When people asked about his time in the service, he'd say he'd been a mechanic on a carrier, nothing special, just one of thousands doing their part. But in his office, hanging on the wall behind his desk, was a framed photograph of a Grumman Hellcat in flight, its silver blue paint catching the light, almost transparent against the pale Pacific sky. And next to it, a letter on official Navy stationery, signed by Admiral Porter himself, thanking aviation machinist mate First Class Leo Hartman for his contribution to the war effort, and noting that while his discovery had been accidental, the determination and skill with which he'd helped develop and deploy it had been anything but. Sea Gray Number 42 remained in use through the Korean War and into the early 1950s, when advances in radar and jet propulsion made visual camouflage less critical than it had been in the propeller age. Eventually, it was superseded by newer paint formulations designed for different tactical environments and different aircraft profiles. But in the official histories of naval aviation, in the technical manuals and the after-action reports, the designation remained, a small footnote to a massive conflict. A reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from mistakes, from accidents, from men like Leo Hartman, who mixed the wrong things together and created something valuable. The pilots who'd flown with Leo's paint, the ones who survived the war and came home to build families and careers they remembered. At reunions and memorial services, they'd sometimes tell the story of the invisible planes, of the mechanic who couldn't read labels properly and ended up saving lives. The story would grow in the telling, as stories do, becoming more dramatic and more miraculous with each recounting. But the core truth remained that in March 1943, A tired mechanic in a dim paint locker grabbed the wrong drum and mixed it with the right paint, and the result was something that nobody expected and everybody needed. Leo lived to see the jet age give way to the space age, to see aircraft carriers grow into floating cities, and naval aviation evolve beyond anything he'd imagined on the deck of the Constellation. He died in 1978, quietly and without fuss, in a veterans hospital in Ann Arbor. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his Navy service, but said nothing about Sea Gray number 42. That information was still technically classified, buried in archives that wouldn't be open to the public for another decade. But in a small museum at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, there's an exhibit about camouflage and deception in naval aviation. And in that exhibit, between displays about radar-absorbent materials and stealth technology, there's a sample panel painted in faded blue-gray, labeled Sea Gray number 42. The placard notes that it was developed in 1943 by a ground mechanic working from incomplete information, that it provided a measurable tactical advantage in Pacific operations, and that it represented the kind of practical innovation that characterized American industrial and military success in World War II. The placard doesn't mention Leo Hartman by name. It doesn't need to. The paint speaks for itself, a quiet testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest contributions come from unexpected places, that mistakes can become miracles, and that the men who win wars aren't always the ones holding guns. Sometimes they're the ones holding paintbrushes, mixing chemicals in cramped lockers, doing their jobs as best they can, and stumbling into history without meaning to. And somewhere in the Pacific, dissolved in rust and coral after 80 years beneath the waves, there are still aircraft wearing Leo Hartman's accidental masterpiece, planes that went down in combat or accidents, their paint long since surrendered to the sea. But for the years they flew, for the missions they completed, and the men they brought home, they wore their invisible armor with distinction, a reminder that in war, as in life, the smallest details can have the largest consequences, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources, mixed wrong and applied right, turning error into advantage and accident into legend.